Today's guest is Samantha Bradshaw, who is the founder of InLine Legal, which is Virginia's pioneering 100% virtual law firm. Specializing in small business and intellectual property law, Samantha is dedicated to safeguarding entrepreneurs and creatives from legal pitfalls. With a history of working overseas, she brings a global perspective to her practice. And lastly, Samantha harnesses the power of the internet to deliver affordable, precise, and accessible legal solutions, teaching entrepreneurs to shield their assets and thrive in the digital age. So, Samantha, thank you very much for being on. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I've had like a few lawyers on like come on here, but I think this is the first one that's had like a unique spin in the way that I guess they practice law or kind of what it is that they specialize in. So I'd love for you to just add to that and let us know like how did you get to doing what you're doing and specializing in what you do.
Sure. Well, if you've had a few lawyers on, you've probably realized at this point we're a particularly special breed of people. I think it takes a kind of warped sense of humor to want to go into an industry where all you're doing all the time is trying to fix other people's problems. But as to how I got here, the fun version of the story is I graduated law school into the height of the recession. They were still firing, well, the height of the legal recession. They were still firing partners. They certainly weren't hiring new associates. So I packed my bags and I left the US. I went to Lebanon for 5 years and practiced there as foreign of counsel, helping all the non-Lebanese companies get into Lebanon, and the Lebanese companies operate outside of Lebanon. Worked with a bunch of medium-sized businesses, and my heart kind of broke when a friend of mine, he became a friend, he wasn't a friend at the time, he wanted to open a board game cafe. He had the idea that board games could teach you amazing soft skills that are super helpful, particularly in a country like Lebanon where they have been through so much. And he thought of this as kind of like therapy meets fun. And in Lebanon, unlike the United States, you are required to have a lawyer on retainer just to exist as a company. So he came to my firm, and I went to our managing partner and was like, there's this business that I would really like to support. I'll take on all the work for it, but I would like to give them a price point that a small business can come up with. And the managing partner wasn't willing to do that. He played with bigger fish. He knew his market, but I wanted to help mine. So that's what I wound up creating when I left Lebanon for the US again. And now we're in Brazil and hopefully still continuing to do that.
I mean, that is, I think, what one of the cooler like origin stories that I've heard, and I've heard like a lot of cool ones here, but definitely this one's like at the top. Just because it seemingly from the outside, it's like very random. Like, if you were to
It's
just take the pieces
crazy.
of like Lebanon law and like small business, like what do those three things have in common? You'd be like nothing, but yet they actually do. So yeah, I mean, anything else you want to comment to that? Floor is yours for it.
Oh no, I think that small businesses, I mean, like a lot of the folks listening, this is the cornerstone of being able to really elevate any socioeconomic status. It's one that's accessible. It's one that you can do without having to go to university, without having to get some checkbox filled that somebody else has determined. For me, this is the ultimate equalizer, especially with the internet.
I 110% would agree with you on that one. And I mean, I've said it on the podcast many times where like I believe, you know, like good people need to make as much money as possible
Yeah.
because that's the only way it's going to get funneled into good things. And in my opinion, the best and fastest way to do that is through your own enterprise and doing your own thing. So yeah, 110%. I'm on board with that core message. And this is a very cool way to actually support that, which is like you don't it's kind of like accounting in my opinion. Like nobody thinks about the legal until like, something breaks or yeah.
Yeah.
So again, anything you want to comment to that, I'm happy to give you the space for that.
No, yeah, it's just that. It's one of those. I mean, look, every person who supports businesses, every B2B person is like, oh, my industry is the foundation. It's like building the foundation for your house. You wouldn't put a roof on the house without the foundation. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you legal is the foundation. It's not. Having a good product that people are willing to buy is the foundation. But it is one of those things that if you get to the point when you have a problem and you've decided that's when you're going to address it, it's too late to get away from this in an easy way.
Yeah, it's
Um,
almost like at least what I'm kind of was visualizing you describing that. I'm like, okay, it's not the foundation, yeah, but it's kind of like the screws and the nails that hold the foundation together. You know what I mean? Like you need
yeah,
those pieces in place for it to all function. So anyway, so I'd love to then know because like okay, you have this role where you're like supporting other people to essentially, make their dreams a reality. So I think that's this perfect segue to just kind of dive into like what can I support you with today?
yeah. So I mean, what you do on this podcast is so fascinating to me because it's such a unique and vulnerable space that I think we don't really get to hear a lot from when so much of what we look at for businesses is when there are wins, when they have hit a certain revenue level, when they do have a big enough team that they can take them on like an all expenses paid trip once a year kind of stuff. Finding spaces where you can talk about the things that make stuff harder, both personally and professionally, are relatively rare. Um, and particularly for my situation, the past year and a half, my mother passed away at the beginning of 2022. And I have been trying to manage her estate from a continent away, which came with, and I still can't really imagine it because we were on food stamps and welfare and WICs as kids. Somehow, by the time my mother passed away, she had acquired multiple rental properties. Um, and suddenly being thrown into all of that while trying to run my own business, my firm, has made it so that there are periods of basically working 80, 90-hour weeks on my firm and then essentially having to ignore it for like 3 weeks at a time, because I have to go work on things for the estate and the rentals and all of this on another continent. And that has led to some pretty serious feast or famine, both in terms of revenue and in terms of team members, which has made things incredibly difficult to maintain consistency when it comes to marketing and sales, because our first priority is always the clients we already have. So if anything's going to drop, it's the marketing and sales. Um, so, and of course, that kind of feast or famine leads to, cash flow issues, trying to make sure that money is flowing in the right directions to the right people, wondering if we can invest in this thing that will probably help us, but maybe we don't have the money that month because we're in that feast or famine cycle. So it's been pretty heavy.
Yeah, and I acknowledge you for sharing that because it is such, obviously a very big thing, and my condolences to that. I know it's relatively soon that has happened. So I guess my first question to kind of dive into that a little bit further is like there's going to be the circumstantial, tactical aspects that kind of just need to be in place for this to like the estate eventually has an end, right? You know what I mean? Like that's not a
It
forever
should.
thing. Yeah,
Yes.
it should. And I'm not downplaying like the complexity of it. Because it always like obviously I don't have like legal experience in that, but I've seen like family and friends like go through a whole bunch of BS around estates, etc. So even when it seems simple, I know it's generally not simple. So I'm not downplaying any of that at all. I guess what I'm leading more into is like, okay, there is the circumstantial, objective, tactical ways that you're going to navigate with this. One component of that's going to be time.
Mhm.
Um, knowing that, okay, you need to also survive that whole piece, and not just survive, but figure out how to like, can I thrive in this time? Can I move forward in it? What do you feel like you need or not getting as you navigate what needs to happen circumstantially to kind of get you out of this situation?
I think the two big recurring thoughts, of any time I'm like, oh, I wish I could have done this, but the estate is in the way, right? Is really the fact that there's not a certain end date, which makes it very hard to be like, I just got to get to that point. Because every time I think I have the end date in mind, something happens and everything with the estate gets extended. I thought this would have been over a year ago, and we're still going. And I thought it was going to be over Friday. And somehow things have been extended again a couple months. And it just seems like that keeps coming every time, which makes it very hard to maintain, um, momentum and motivation on moving forward with that, not feeling weighed down by it. And then of course the lack of consistent help to be able to consistently hand things over to someone in the business. I've had for, let's see, well, by this, in like 60 days, it'll be 3 companies in 12 months. The 3 different agencies helping us as like our VAs, who have shut down for a whole bunch of well, one's shutting down. The other one got married and just kind of went off the maps for a while, and she couldn't manage her team properly, even though we tried to give her space for the wedding, and she didn't come back in the right way. So then it just becomes a cycle of like, well, I'm trying to make the space for this, but then it's very frustrating when you hope you're giving your team members what they need to do the job done, to do the job well, to get the job done. But then it's not coming back, and then it just comes back on you. You're like, okay, well, why did I bother?
Got it. So if we take out the fact that, okay, like we don't control other people, the only part you have 100% control over
It's so
is
much
yourself.
easier if I could, though.
Listen, my job would also be a whole lot easier if I could just control other people and all the problems go away. So I feel you on that one. You know what I mean? So it's like if I could package it also in a pill and also sell that, it would also be a lot
Yeah.
easier. But
Oh,
alas, I'm working on both, so I will keep you
all right, all
posted
right.
when that happens. Um, so yeah, so then kind of narrowing the scope to the part that you do control, right, which is yourself. So if something is recurring, then the common denominator is going to be ourselves in
Sure.
that recurring pattern. So what do you think you brought to the table for this to recur?
So particularly when it comes to like maintaining team members, I know, and I'm quite aware of the fact that in trying to be a kind manager, boss, employer, whatever you want to call it, um, when I've had super problematic team members, it's almost like I'm happy to tell them their mistakes and explain why we were supposed to do a certain task, a certain project a different way. But I'm terrible at actually being like, no, you've hit the limit of mistakes, or warning beforehand of like, this is the amount of mistakes that can happen. That's acceptable. Or this is the number of times that I'm willing to tell you something before it becomes like you were just ignoring me and doing the task wrong, rather than accepting that human mistakes are mistakes, they happen. And that has certainly made things harder, for sure. As far as the estate stuff goes, oh, I wish it would be much easier if I could, get people on the other side to answer emails, get folks to pay rent on time, make the banks work faster. And I mean, all of that's just, unfortunately, that's not possible. Giving myself more space to take care of this would have been the answer. But I chose other things.
That's fair. And I think with the estate, it's kind of like, again, there's so many factors that you don't control that it's just the bigger question is how do I manage and work around it, not necessarily
Right.
what I'm contributing to it. So I agree with you on that part. Going back to what you shared with regards to the management aspect. So I'm trying to be a kind manager, employer. I'm good at sharing what the actual project is or where people like what people need to do, but I'm terrible at making them known they've kind of hit the limit of their mistakes. So
Mm-hmm.
it kind of sounds from the outside looking in that there's a part of you that essentially optimizes for some version of being liked and accepted more than for like being effective in the moment. So does that resonate with you or no?
My husband would say no. He would say I'm incredibly disagreeable. um, but uh, I think it's easier to have those disagreeable conversations when you're interacting on a regular basis, one on one, ideally in person, but at least over video. Like Slack is not the space for those kinds of conversations. And a couple months into the year, I implemented like a weekly, so we have a daily check-in of like basically what they plan they're going to do. And then at the end of the day, like they say how much they did get done out of what they planned to do. And the idea being that if there's a huge difference between those two things, we have to have a discussion about why something's taking longer than they thought it would, or what happened during that day or time period. As well as weekly video calls that go for up to an hour. And those video calls always feel very rushed because we're just going through of like, did you get this? No, I ran into this problem. Okay, let's fix that. And it's kind of just running down this checklist and almost not leaving time for those more fluid discussions where that would feel more natural, I think. That's certainly something could be implemented.
Okay. So again, I don't think it's kind of like you're coming up and brainstorming your own tactical solutions to a lot of these things. So it doesn't sound to me like you lack the tactical, objective, strategic components of like what can be done to solve this. I'm curious, like, what is your thought process when the first mistake happens, and like your default reaction is to, you know, something with regards to like, okay, you kind of let it go, some version of that. What is your thought process when that's happening?
I think running through mistakes, and actually I just had the agency that's shutting down on me. They gave me one of their folks. She only worked for a month before the agency realized there was a problem, and they actually took her off my account. But what had been happening with that, and it's just the most recent example. For example, we try to send out a newsletter every 2 weeks. Generally what happens is I send a voice note or try to like type out a newsletter, and then they're just formatting it and getting links from different places that I've told the links are supposed to go, occasionally grabbing a few graphics from like predetermined places. And the way I have things set up is we have a best practices list, and it's completely searchable. And most of them come with a Loom video that has a transcript, which is theoretically supposed to make things incredibly simple, even if it's the first time doing the task. I took the first vacation that I had taken in 2 years when this assistant was supposed to format the newsletter, basically. And in my head, I was like, this is such a simple task, and I've explained things to her very thoroughly before I left. I understand she's new, but this will be fine. It will be okay. Until I got the newsletter in my email and saw mistake after mistake after mistake. If it had been one mistake, probably would have ignored it and just brought it up later. There were so many that I sat down that evening and made notes in the Microsoft Teams channel that we chat through. And there was just a general feeling of frustration of, I don't understand why I put all this effort into creating like this Loom video. There's a written description. It doesn't matter your learning style. Literally all you had to do was follow the checklist that's attached to this. How did so many things go wrong? So that being said, it depends on the severity of the mistake. If it's a small thing, some things genuinely aren't worth the effort, the brain power to even have the conversation. If there's a multitude of mistakes, I get incredibly frustrated, and I try to make sure that when I'm communicating the mistakes, that I'm explaining why it's important that that thing be done that way, whatever it is. Because I fully believe that if you explain to people why you want something done that way, they're more likely to do it rather than just, no, make the wall blue. What? Why? Who cares? Right? But then when she submitted more work that all had similar levels of mistakes, it got to the point where I had considered actually reaching out to the owner of the company and requesting a new assistant, because there were so many in such a short period of time. And then the owner of the company took her off of my account. So I actually didn't have to do anything. I can't tell you where that would have gone, but I know what went through my head at least.
Got it. Okay. So what about historically? Like, what goes through your head when somebody makes a mistake? What's your initial thought or narrative around that?
I think in the past year, I've made an active effort to try to see why that mistake would have been made. What was lacking in the training materials? What may have been lacking in instructions? as a first step, and figuring out, what was that not explained well to them? How can we make that more clear? When mistakes keep happening again, like it's the same mistake and it's been explained why and pointed back to them, the training material, then it goes to a pure frustration of like, why bother? I could have done it myself. It only took 20 minutes for this task to be done. I've spent 5 minutes reviewing it, 10 minutes correcting it, and 5 minutes reviewing the correction. I should have just done it myself.
Okay. So when it gets to that point, like, have there been like multiple times that this mistake has happened, or with this individual, it's like multiple times, or it's like the very first time that that's happened, this is what you go into?
No, 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 certainly not the first time. It's, let's say if there's a larger task and there's a bunch of mistakes, I'm like, okay, something was really, really missed. Or if it's a recurring task and they just keep making the same mistake and we are addressing it, that's when it gets to that level of frustration.
Okay. And what do you do when there's like a first infraction?
First one is generally, hey, I think I understood why you made this mistake. Here's a link to the best practices that explains the whole thing, like in total. Please review this again. This is why we do it this way, this thing that you did wrong. Take care next time. And if it happens the second time, it's like, hey, we talked about this. What happened? And the third time, it's like, okay, like, are you not listening? You're not listening. Why aren't you? What's lacking here?
Okay, got it. So do you, like, when you're communicating with them, are you communicating what the outcome is supposed to be? Are you communicating what is the expected level of standard, or are you communicating to them how do you do the task?
How to do the task versus level of standard. I'm trying to see where that would be a differentiation. Um, because I'm thinking here, because if somebody sends an email and it's not the way I would write it, but it's within an acceptable like brand voice and everything, I don't really say anything about that ever. We have a brand voice guideline that I'm like, oh, that actually, we definitely say it like that, or we definitely don't. Maybe update the brand voice guideline. And I think that's what you're meaning by like within a whatever the acceptable standard is.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. So that's right along
yeah,
the
yeah.
the same lines. And it's I guess to add to that or clarify. So like when you're speaking about a lot of these things, you're speaking about in terms of like, okay, well, why are you doing it this way? Let me explain to you why it's important for you to do it this way. Why did I think about doing it this way? Which, yeah, I think there's definitely a time and place to understand why behind a particular thing, right? And what I'm not hearing, and doesn't necessarily mean it's not done, but just what I haven't heard from when you were sharing all of this is like, this is the expectations of the outcome. This is the outcome that I want. This is how we verify that the outcome is there. And it seems like what's missing is some intermediary step to like show me that you understand and can deliver on this one particular outcome, so that like cumulatively, when it's all added up, it the cumulative outcome of the big piece, like let's just say editing,
Mm.
something like that's all been confirmed by both sides. Because it's like every time you're speaking, what I'm hearing is like, you're like, this is red, and they're like, well, I thought it was blue, and then we're kind of like arguing what color it is, and it's like we can never
Right.
actually overlap because we're seeing two completely different things. So what comes up for you when I share that?
I understand now. So I make an active effort when somebody new comes on board. For example, if we're talking about our email marketing, the first thing I have them do is simply formatting the newsletter. It's literally just formatting and grabbing links so they can get comfortable with how things are written. I give them, I'm like, oh, for the link, you need to go find the thing for this, and it's over here, right? Um, and after they've done that well enough for a while, then I'm like, okay, the formatting's good. Then it becomes a thing of, are you comfortable writing if I give you a general idea? If they say yes or no, then we let them move into some kind of like copy editing. If they really like working within like the structure of our email marketing provider, then I'm like, okay, would you like to spend some time learning workflows? And you can update and improve our workflows. So in that aspect, I think we try to give them pieces of like, okay, you understand the basic thing of this like larger task of email marketing, right? Which is just taking stuff from a Google Doc and putting it into the format. And we try to step them up from there. Generally how I like to do things. And maybe it's not explicitly clear in that the standard, but the idea is that in that feedback, as they're moving up through more and more complicated tasks, that they're getting that feedback that shows them the standard.
Well, theoretically, that is a great idea, right? I guess I'm more pointing to
Well,
the
yeah, it's
fact
not
that
working though. So let's
exactly,
keep
like
talking about
in
it.
terms of what the results are showing, it's like there's some disconnect there,
Yeah.
right? And if you're saying, well, these standards aren't explicit, or maybe they're not explicit enough, like to me, that's always the first place to look at when it comes to this type of team dynamics, because like you can right away assume that your best bet is that 90% communication is going to happen across the board. And that's like best case scenario. So more or
Yeah.
less, we're talking about 60% on average, like it's a pretty good day. Okay. So if we both are going to screw up the communication by default, then we both need an anchor to drive the communication towards like what this is actually about. So if there's no standard on like what makes an effective output that we have both agreed upon, and that in the training and or onboarding somebody has demonstrated proficiency in that, then it's really hard to then expect people to go live with that, because
Mm-hmm.
there's just a lot of unknowns that are happening across the board, especially if it sounds like, you know, through history, like you've just gotten more and more people into the process, and it's kind of like, okay, well, like it's different if like you had somebody for like a year and like they kind of know the intricacies a little bit better. So like this is a bit of a different conversation at that point. But it's like
The
if we're
amazing thing
yeah,
is, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you, but if I feel this is crucial. The amazing thing is across, let's say, just for our like virtual assistant kind of work, and I'm sticking to that to try to keep some
yeah,
standard. I would say every other, maybe every third person, they come in and they understand everything off the bat based on the systems that we have and based on the onboarding we have. And fair enough, there's some people that just aren't good fits and it doesn't work out. But then there's some people who like kind of get it and kind of sort of do with the feedback and kind of sort of deal with the onboarding. And it's just it's a frustration. Even my clients complain about it. Feels like throwing a dart at a board. And it shouldn't feel that way when you've put in when you think you've put in at least a lot of effort and a lot of thought into these processes.
yeah, and that's totally fair, because it takes a lot of like it takes a lot of work to just establish the training, like, you know, modules and whatever, like work, like to unpack my head into like, okay, well, what is it that I actually want here? Like I'm not downplaying how much work that actually takes to create the SOPs and the processes and the systems. um I think, again, going back to just, okay, well, what's the part that I control? So if I'm the leader in this instance, and it all like if I'm going to take 100% ownership, because at the end of the day, like it's my name, you know, on the door type of
Yeah.
deal, then okay, like out of 10 people that I hire, 30% of them get this right away. Cool. Then it's like, well, do you want to keep hiring people like that and trying to see, okay, well, how can I filter to get more people like that based off of the processes that I have? Or is there something in the processes that work for people like that, but don't work for the majority? You know, and then like, what can I modify with that? So it's not at all like one way is better than the other. It's kind of like what works for you as the leader, but there's clearly something in that, because it's a pattern that keeps
Yeah.
being perpetuated. Either I'm not hiring the people that this works for, I'm not filtering, or that there's something in this setup that maybe the A players can get, but the average person can't. Therefore, what can I add to that to optimize for that? So what lands for you with that reflection?
Um, every time I go back through any system, any process, anything in our business, it is always, oh, that was the first iteration. We can do better. Right? Always. And I think any business owner that's going to be able to keep things running long term has to look at things that way. Um, So I've actually opened my best practices vault while we're on this. And I'm looking at them like, okay, what can be added? What can be simplified? How can I give this to somebody in an easier way? Um,
So, okay, if since
yeah,
you're
we always,
looking at it and inspecting it right now, right? Do you have explicit standards for output? Do you have explicit expectations on like, okay, this is what it looks like to output this thing?
so that's the simple answer is no. Look, I'm a lawyer. I can talk my way around it all day. So I'll give you the easy one. The answer is no.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. So thank you.
Um, So what we do have, right? We've got searchable names, what other processes it could be related to. If we have clear KPIs around whatever that task may be related to, those are supposed to be attached as well. Kind of larger groupings of what that task is part of, whether it's like back office or finance or marketing, sales, whatever. Typically there's a Loom video attached, if not a couple. Different guides, if we've got like written guides around that thing instead of a Loom video, written descriptions of the task if we've gotten around to that. Loom video is generally the first thing I do, and then some assistant's job to write out the task list. And then we've got a task owner's like additional notes or updates and changes to the Loom video. So that way, if I can't re-record Loom videos all the time, or they're not comfortable recording Loom videos, there's supposed to be an additional note period here that's supposed to put those little clarifications in there.
Perfect.
And
So I just,
particularly
I
when
think
we
it's
get
pretty clear,
feedback,
like in terms of processes, like you're
process
very
should
good.
be like on point. Yeah.
Correct. Like I think in terms of like creating the process in general, the components of it, I think are
Yeah.
110% there, right? I guess let's just say, well, I'll just use examples from like my own business with regards to how we
Sure.
effectively do this. Let's just say even in this podcast production, right? So when okay, so let's just say in the even the like the research phase of like the guests that are going to be pitched. So yes, they're pitched on my behalf, but they're pitched by my assistant. So for you and for everybody else that's been a guest here, it's probably my assistant that reached out to you initially. It's kind of like, okay, in the training there was, okay, so this is my criteria on who in general I would want to reach out to based off
Mhm.
of me just looking at like, okay, who do I want to like speak with and want to be on here? Okay, cool. To me it sounds like you have that. And then
Yeah.
parts that I've added like in the training to ensure that that always happens is like, okay, here are examples of people that fit this criteria with the actual profiles, and then here are examples of people that don't, right? And then like in the explanations, I was like, okay, why? So now that has a clear outcome of like, okay, this is why I messaged this person, but this is why I said no to this person. And get their confirmation that they understand that. And then the secondary part of it, like I go into it knowing they're going to screw up at some point because obviously
Right.
they can't be in my head. But then as soon as that happens and the feedback starts, like, okay, hold on. What was the standard that we were going for? Oh, it was this. Okay, cool.
Right.
Why not do you think this meets that standard? Well, because of X, Y, Z. And then we have a discussion about the standard itself, not like why can't you follow instructions? And then through multiple iterations of that, they get to a point where they've actually shown me that they can deliver on this one particular task. So even when I was asking you these questions, it was kind of from that frame where
Mhm.
something like creating a newsletter, it's a bit more complex because there's a lot of subjective elements to that. But
Mhm.
you can still come up with examples of what that standard does or does not look like. So what lands for you with that?
No, I think that's a good way to reframe uh the conversations. And I think we have a very small version of that right now. And again, going back to like everything's a first iteration, right? Whenever I do review work, and particularly if I notice something that I know is different or that I know I haven't explained well in the initial video, I'm like, oh, that's something you should put in those like additional notes thing. That's something I need you to be aware of. Um, but I think it removes probably a defensiveness that could come up if I'm like, well, this is what you should do, rather than like, well, this is the standard. Does this meet it? Why do you think it doesn't meet it or it does meet it?
Correct.
So I think yeah, I think that's a really nice way to let someone self-evaluate without criticism.
Yeah.
from another
And
person anyway. Like it's self-criticism, which is somehow deeper and more damaging.
yeah. And actually, I'm
That's just
glad
me. I
that
don't wish that on any of my team members. Let me be very clear.
absolutely. And I believe you with that. But I think it's, again, I want to acknowledge you for diving into that because oftentimes, especially when I have, business owners that start to have team dynamic issues, a lot of the times the root cause of them kind of derails or comes back to exactly what you said, some sort of like self-criticism or self-defense, right? Because if you
Mm-hmm.
trace back what you just said, so, oh, it's actually more beneficial if we kind of are discussing the standard versus like you did or did not do this correctly. Well, firstly, for somebody that's coming into it from the lens of like, I'm trying to be a kind manager, like right off the bat, I know there's a part of you that's like, that's why I asked you, like, are you optimizing for being liked or not? I don't think that's that explicit with you, but there's a part
Well,
of you that like wants the cohesion, like that's like really important. And not just like you want a good work environment, of course, but just like you want the cohesion socially. So if that's the case, it's like, well, then there's like the trigger internally of like, well, you not doing this right means I made this process wrong or something here is not listened to. I'm not being acknowledged. I'm not being listened to as the boss. So now you're kind of bringing your own subconscious drama to the whole thing.
into the situation. Yeah,
Yeah,
which is,
exactly.
I haven't in years of therapy. We're still working on it, y'all.
Yeah, that's
That was good. That was a good one. That one stuck. Congratulations, sir.
thank you. So what landed for you from that?
Um, very much the idea of it is wildly important to me to create jobs that I would have been happy to have, that I would still be happy to have, in environments that I would be comfortable working in and want to do good work in. Um, that's not necessarily like expressed as a firm value, but that's for me, that's crucial in setting these up. I really do try to make things as easily accessible as possible for anybody who comes onto our team. And yeah, the general idea of like framing questions in a way that my own triggers don't get activated in my interactions with people that's super helpful.
Beautiful. So like if you're okay to dive deeper into like what is it about that you find super helpful?
I think quite often when I realize I'm getting frustrated, um, both in my professional and my personal life, right? I think the prevailing idea, or at least the one that's in my head, is okay, step back, take a breath, and then come back to the situation. But it's not necessarily come back to the situation with a reframe or come back to the situation in a way that's not going to trigger whatever nonsense you're still going through, right? Because we're all going through our own God knows what. Um, so I think it's that additional step, again, that other iteration of okay, cool, yeah, you're frustrated, go step away and figure out how to reframe this in a way that you're not frustrated anymore, in a way that's not pissing you off internally.
So I think that's a great example of a like this is how I cope with the shit
Mm-hmm.
situation. And it's
Mm-hmm.
a beautiful thing because it's necessary. It's certainly at stressful times. You need effective ways to pause, to reframe, etc. And even in my own programs, like I call it the pattern pause. So it's basically a practice to take 10 minutes, pause when you feel yourself going into your limiting patterns. Let's just say if we're using the one that you describe here, it's for lack of a better term, I'll just call it like this is my people pleasing pattern. So like I go into that and it's now manifesting in this moment in the business and it's pulling me towards my default reaction. So taking the pause there to reassess, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is the best next action that I can move towards? What's the feeling that would be associated with that? How can I improve my narrative to get there? Like that's all going to be components of managing and embodying a better way to show up inside of your business.
Mm-hmm.
And its role for doing exercises like that is what I call like in the embodiment step. So like in my process, we go through like reveal, heal, and then embody. So reveal is many ways kind of what we start with on the podcast for people that have become clients after it. Like just mapping out what is actually the issue, what is the root cause of why these things are happening, right? And especially when there's repetition, those are patterns that always we contribute in some ways, especially as the leaders of the business, right?
Yeah.
Then the healing of it is really, how do you bust the beliefs that keep happening? So like, are there any limiting beliefs about, well, it's important to be a kind manager, right? If I'm not a kind manager, then, there's some continuation of that narrative that powers how you view these situations, right? Second part of that is like eliminating the emotional charge around it. So I have an emotional inclination towards a particular action, whether that's the reflex to like, no, this is the right way to do it, why aren't you doing it right? Versus, okay, how can I show up and create processes with a lot more peace of mind that have nothing to do with my inner drama, right? Like that's another aspect of it. So
Yeah.
when you reveal and you heal these processes, then it's a lot easier to go into your field of play, which is your business, and show up in a way that you have to basically cope a lot less and can just do a lot more. So I know this was kind of like a tangent from like what we initially started, but what's landing for you from all of that?
Yeah, I mean, still this recurring idea of like removing that emotional reaction to show up as a better leader. Because that's not, my emotional reaction is only going to make me feel better, maybe, or probably worse. In all reality, it's not actually accomplishing what I wanted or needed to do. Um, yeah, and it's not always easy to be fully aware of when those are showing up. I think until something's going quite wrong. Like when everything's going well, it's much harder to be like, oh no, what's going on here? And you're like, no, everything's fine. Why would I care?
Well, then it's like there's no problem. Like realistically,
Right.
like
Like,
nobody needs to come see me because, like, what, I'm having too much joy. So I would really like to work on like
yeah,
the
we
fact that
gotta
I'm
we gotta
having too
tone
much
that
joy.
down.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's usually not a problem. And honestly, if somebody did come to me as like, what, I'm having too much joy, and be like, well, I would like to work with you and see what I can learn from you in that case. So yeah, I jokes aside, yes, that's exactly it. It's like, this is a problem when it becomes a problem. And usually it becomes a problem when like you've tried all of the other tactical things again and again. And it's like at some point I have to stop focusing on the external to try to outwork this thing, to try to like outlearn a new strategy for it, to try to like outthink it and, force like positivity into the situation. At some point you got to flip that around and look internally. What am I actually bringing to the equation? That's usually what I call like leadership limits. So like, where is the limit to my leadership that will allow me to go to the next level? Um, and emotions oftentimes is the biggest part of that, because it's like I work with a lot of smart people, and it's so easy for us to like intellectualize these things to just, oh
Totally.
yeah, this is, I
Like I told you
understand.
earlier, I
Yeah.
can make up a reason for why something is all day long, but let me be honest and let me try to give you the easier answer so we can move past that.
Yeah, correct. And I appreciate you for it, because I mean that does take like being able to sit with that discomfort to step forward. So well, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I mean that part I think we've fleshed out pretty well. Um, Something that did pop up into my mind, uh, which I think is just fascinating right now, is I know I have issues around I don't pressing send basically on anything or post or whatever. Um, and so I have found and created like tactical solutions to not have to be that person. Like if I have to send an email that makes me really nervous, I schedule send and I schedule send it for like 7 a.m. the next morning when I'm not awake and I can't cancel it.
Yeah, so I think that's a great way again of coping with whatever that is. So okay, when you have issues sending things, are what's the general pattern there? Like, is it when it's a kind of a confrontational or like a critical type email, or is it like a visibility email? Like I have to press send on, I don't know, PR article or like a social media post. Like where does that charge internally come up for you?
It depends on where it's coming from, because on social media, on some days I have no issue posting, or LinkedIn or outreach or things like this. Other days I can't be bothered to write anything nice about myself or my business or any of that. When it comes to emails and like communication with clients or opposing counsel or US Patent and Trademark Office, stuff like this, it's it is because that particular thing feels heavy and critical, and like it's going to either set off a whirlwind of things, or it's like a big decision that, yeah, schedule send.
Got it. Okay. So it's kind of like a, how do I cope with the heaviness that can come from
Yeah.
pressing send? Yeah, that's fair. I think for stuff like that, on the social media part, I think that there's probably some like visibility things that can come into play. The other stuff, I mean, from what you've brought up, I think we would need like more time to dive into what the specifics are. But I would say it probably still has some overlap with regards to if I'm going into confrontational type things or like heavy critical things that involve other people, then I would look at, does the whole, whatever's driving that whole idea, I need to be a kind manager and like a good employer. That sort of general sentiment, if that ripples into decisions like that's kind of the first place that I would look at. And it may or may not land, but that's kind of the first place that I would look at. But I think as far as like coping with it, pretty clever way to actually go around it, to be honest. Just schedule, send, and do what you need to do. So what lands for you from that reflection?
I'm glad my coping mechanisms are clever.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Um, no, it's definitely, I mean, on the outreach and marketing, social media, all that kind of stuff, it's odd because I don't think it's quite visibility. I think once there is visibility and once it's out there, or if something flunks, it doesn't bother me, or if it does really well, I'm excited about it. It's on it is really more of the perfectionism thing of like, oh no, this thing didn't go in exactly the spot that I put it, and like the formatting got weird on me, and now that part doesn't make any sense. Like, oh well.
Mm, okay, got it. And perfectionism in general is just the fancy way of talking about self-doubt, right? Like
Yeah.
if I didn't doubt myself, it doesn't matter if it is or isn't perfect, because logically I understand this thing that I post, it's going to be out of people's intention like within 24 hours,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's a good
So
reminder.
yeah, it is a good reminder to
Reminder.
soothe. So definitely, yeah, I mean, we can continue to dive into that. I just want to be conscious on time, but even just as far as like mapping out, let's just say we spent the most time on like the team ideas and like the dynamics of that, like does this feel complete for you, or is there still something left outstanding?
I mean, I think these conversations can never be complete, truly. Um, but I think it's quite sufficient for today. I've had enough therapy for today. Thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome for volunteering to do it as well. So yeah, I acknowledge you for that. I appreciate you for it. And yes, I agree with you. At the end of the day, this is the part that opens up what this could be. And then obviously there's a lot more things to do from there. Um, but yeah, if that does feel sufficient for today, I'd love for you to just then close us off and let everybody know, where to find you, who's the best person to find you. Floor is yours for that.
Oh, that's very kind. So yeah, if you like my coping mechanisms, maybe don't use them and go check out his program. Um, but if you want to have a chat with me about any other clever coping mechanisms or maybe how I get rid of them, my name's Samantha Bradshaw. You can find me at InLine Legal on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and our website's www.inlinelegal.com.
Awesome. Well, we'll include all of the links minus the coping mechanisms.
Are
So
you sure? I can make a PDF on that one. Show people where the
I'm
schedule
sure you
comes from.
could. That would be formatted perfectly with the standards that you're going to set
It
for.
will. You
Yeah.
have no idea.
So yes, I can promise the links, can't promise the the coping mechanisms. But yes, thank you very much for being on, and as always, for everybody else listening, we'll see you on the next one.